Thank you, Madam Chair. There's so much on my mind here. Thanks to your willingness to hear this bill and give a lot of time to it. We have made the first step on what's going to be a long journey. It's a journey that a lot of states are taking, or at least considering. Vermont and New York have really taken the first step, and by passing these laws, as we've said, these bills are in legislatures around the country. I think it's an inevitable journey because as I look forward, what are we headed for in Oregon and the West? Nobody knows for sure. All the trends indicate to me that we have ahead of us really, really difficult wildfire years. Our ability to manage them, respond to them, prevent them, reduce their severity, that's all up in question. It has to do with what kind of resources we're going to put into them. Another thing we're going to be deciding this session. But pretty much all the trends that I've read about point to hotter, drier, windier summers, as we've seen in the last few years. And we've seen what happens there. We are now approaching a time of billion-dollar plus costs every year for Oregon. In 2024, we spent in the neighborhood of $350 million on suppression. The national analysis and research estimates that the total cost to a state of wildfire is between 10 and 25 times what the suppression cost was. So if that's the benchmark, you're talking $3.5 to $7 or $8 billion in 2024. There is no indication that that's going to go down. I'm certainly, like everybody, I hope that's wrong. I hope we can fund wildfire to do what we can to prevent. But that's the likeliest future. What we know is there is no possible way we can afford to deal with those damages, the damages to communities, to infrastructure, to businesses. It goes on and on and on. I think, I'm not going to say what I just said is undebatable, but I certainly think it's high probability. We have made the case, Senator Pham and I and others, that a just and moral solution to this is climate accountability from the fossil fuel companies. I won't go into repeat all of that, but it has to do with what they are documented to have known decades ago, the public relations campaign they put forward that slowed down development of alternative energy sources that we could be using, their enormous wealth, partially based on that misinformation campaign. It strikes me that it's kind of inevitable that we're going to have to go here. And it's also inevitable that it's not going to happen fast. I would expect years of litigation. We've all known that. So that gives me more agency that we should start down this road. And as I say, your decision to hear this bill is a start. That's never happened before in this building. I think the next step is to pass the policy in this committee, send it down to Ways and Means. We all know it would have a real challenge in Ways and Means. There are stand-up costs to this program. But I would like to affirm, if it is the will of three or more of those of us sitting here, that this is a important and legitimate and morally justified policy, so that however many years it's going to take to get through the courts, we're at least starting. So if it's a 7-year process, we start getting some recompense for our costs in 7 years. If we put it off a session or two, it's 9 years or 11 years. And I don't know how long we can last, but I think there's an inevitable outcome here, pretty close to it. And I want to start the work. And with that, I thank you for your consideration of my thoughts, Senator Pham's thoughts, and of that of so many Oregonians who testified.
All right, thank you. Senator Pham.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Well, I will say that my understanding is that this bill will not be advancing to a work session today, and I just want to say I'm deeply disappointed. Right now, There are so many Oregonians who are suffering right now from the impacts of wildfires, from the extreme weather events, from the droughts. It is impacting our, as we heard, it's impacting our forests, our fisheries, our farms, and most importantly and tragically, it's impacting or it's taking Oregonians' lives. And we've known that climate change would have exactly these impacts since 1981, to Senator Golden's point. And so I think, frankly, to further delay finding a way to help fund Oregon to help recover and actually build our resilience to these disasters, these climate-fueled disasters, is an insult to the people who have died and to the Oregonians who are paying right now to rebuild their lives and our communities. But I will say that Monday, we had our hearing room packed to the gills with an overflow room of Oregonians from all different generations, from all different parts of the state, from all different walks of life, all saying that they wanted to, one, share their stories of the suffering that they've had or what they felt and endured because of climate change fueled disasters. And what I most took away, though, was not just the suffering, was this just the strength and resilience from our communities in the face of these disasters. And so I want to just say to everyone who is watching and listening and looking to the legislature for action, that your advocacy and your stories and your presence in the legislature have moved me. And they have moved others on this committee, and they are moving people in the legislature. And I look forward to working with all of you and working with my colleagues in the coming session and the sessions to continue to advance and build this bill, build our coalition and advance this bill until we're able to win it.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I appreciate the conversation. I found this bill very interesting in looking through it, because we seem to have some agreement in a number of ways with regards to the catastrophic wildfires that are across our state. In fact, just a quick, globally, in 2022, there was 5.3 billion tons of CO2 released because of wildfires across the globe. When we look at wildfires in Oregon, 82% of them on federal land. Of the 18% that are on of acres burned on private land, 15% of those acres are burned because of fires that start and burn on federal land and burn on the private land. And of the 3% of acres that burn on private land from fires that start on private land, 98% of those are kept to less than 100 acres because they're a managed resource. And and since my time in the legislature, since 2017, prior to that as a county commissioner, we have been pushing back, and it's been this huge fight with the environmental for-profit nonprofits on managing our forest resources so that we can protect those resources from wildfire, protect our communities, and mitigate the millions and billions of metric tons of CO2. And I just want to remind everyone that when I was the co-chair, the co-vice chair on the Joint Committee on Carbon Reduction, I had DEQ Director Whitman in my committee, and I asked him, if we were to go to carbon zero tomorrow in Oregon, what would the impact be? And he said, Representative Brock Smith, you are correct. The Oregon's portion of global carbon emissions, I'll use the word minuscule. And then when I asked Dr. Philip Mote, who was the director of Oregon Climate Services and the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute, was asked what the impact would be on the global climate if Oregon were to reduce their emissions to zero. And he responded, the impact would be imperceptible. So as we continue with conversations in this committee and in this body, as you see me support renewable energy projects across this state, I hope that I can have you and we can continue to come together so that we can reduce those carbon emissions from wildfire, because we have the understanding, the science, and hopefully the resources in the future to be able to do that work to mitigate that. But we've also heard in this committee as we move forward that we have an increase in upwards of 40% on our electric bills. And when asked, when I mentioned that that was because of the transition into the more renewable energy, I was refuted as they said, actually, we haven't even implemented those yet. To which my comment was, God help us. So as we continue to look at these situations moving forward, any tax on a fossil fuel industry is, as we're looking at a transportation package and so forth, when we know, according to DEQ Director Whitman, it's minuscule, and from Director Moat, it's imperceptible. But what it will do is increase the price and cost to Oregonians. So I look forward to the conversation as we continue to have it moving forward, so that we can have a holistic view, and maybe we can reduce emissions and protect communities from catastrophic wildfires as well.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Senator Robinson.
Yes, after.
Senator Robinson.
If we're going to have this discussion, I think we should, I have a different view of this. I think we should have a scientific discussion, maybe bring in some scientists from both sides of this to actually discuss it from those grounds. And not to trivialize people who have lost their homes in wildfires, get badly hurt fire, it destroys lives. I understand all that. The argument is what's causing that. And I think CO2 is a weak greenhouse gas, and for a lot of reasons, it just doesn't fit the scientific data. That you can go back to oil companies and find people in those companies who were worried about it way back is not surprising. This has been discussed for a long time. Even some people who are strongly opposed, scientists who are working in the past, were strongly opposed in the end to the idea that humans were causing climate change, started out worrying about it because they knew that CO2 was a weak greenhouse gas and they thought the issue should be studied, and then ultimately came to a different conclusion. So I'm in favor of a scientific discussion on the issue before we blame the fuel companies. And I do think if we're going to find them, we have to stop using their product. It's a problem. So, and that's not going to go over well.
Thank you. Senator Golden.
Surprise, we've got a big can of worms to open. I want to respond to a couple of points if I can. I really need to get things on the record. I've heard the good senator from the South Coast numerous times quote former DEQ Director Whitman saying the effect of our climate programs on global emissions would be minuscule. My understanding is he did say that. I've also heard his unhappiness at the context in which is being used, because he would have said, as do all of us working on this, that the point is not the percentage of global emissions that come from Oregon, which is extreme. It's well under 1%. It is the notion that in the absence of national action by the biggest per capita carbon fuel consumer in the world, a strategy was that a number of states, as many as possible, would implement programs, develop a market, standard programs, and that because the option was not there when we were working on these bills of national action, which is much preferable, states would take it on themselves and unite and coordinate. So the issue is really not, and I'm quite sure Mr. Whitman would say this if he were here, what's the percentage of global emissions that come from Oregon? So I wanted to make that point, put that on the record. The other is that the good senator and I have talked publicly on dioceses like these and privately many times about forest management and the role that it plays in our wildfire. I think in some ways we differ, in some ways we agree. But I think that's aside from the issue of the ferocity of these fires and their connection to fossil fuels, which of course Senator Robinson and I and others have a disagreement about. But whatever the source, the ignition point for these fires, what we are talking about are the conditions of the fuels and the intensity that builds. So there are fires that start in federal forests, no questions about it. There are fires that start right in the WUI, and the devastating one in my district started in a little vacant lot on the edge of a suburban development. there are a number, and there may be more that start on federal forests. I think there's some difference of views on that. Wherever they start, the reason they've become mega fires with these astonishing flame lengths and intensity that are becoming almost impossible to fight has to do with the conditions of the fuels and the winds. And the trends of those, we can argue why, have been upward consistently for 20 or 30 years now. So the matter of where the fires start and that discussion about how much attention we should put to forest management, legitimate discussion, is in my view apart from this issue, which in my view is what has climate change done to our fuels, the immediate conditions that amplify fire, that turn the fires, historic fires, into the mega fires that are doing what they're doing to the western United States.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, I just want to say I thank my colleagues for bringing this bill concept forward and this discussion that we are having. I thank the advocates and the others that came before us to testify in favor of this bill. We heard youth voices ring very strong in this room. Climate change is a real threat to our future. It is. And I understand the urgent need to do everything we can to stop it and to stop its continued advancement. The stories that we heard in this hearing room were real and very painful to hear. But we do ask folks to come forward for positive change, and we ask them to do so a lot of the times by reliving trauma that they have experienced and continue to do so. They do it because that will lead to change, and they are hopeful it will do so. Myself and many of my colleagues are committed to addressing climate change and the causes of climate change and the impacts to Oregonians. We will continue to demand effective climate action policy that requires carefully crafted legislation that brings all stakeholders together for smooth and effective implementation. There are concerns about moving forward with this particular bill at this time, and one of those reasons is because of the unresolved legal challenges on similar policies in other states. If we pass this legislation at this time, we may likely be putting Oregon at risk of needing to defend it against legal challenges, which will be very expensive at a time when fiscal responsibility across our state government is critically important. We also need to reflect on how our actions impact the professional legislative staff, those who work behind the scenes to make our work here possible. Today is the first chamber deadline across most committees. The LPRO, LFO, LRO, and LC staffers are currently managing an extremely heavy workload due to the record number of bills introduced this session. Good legislation requires adequate time and attention from our staff, from agencies, and advocates to ensure that it achieves its intended goals. So the people of Oregon want action on climate solutions, and so do I. I will continue to work in an open and inclusive way with anyone who wants to help protect Oregon's climate, and I look forward to having those urgent conversations. And I thank you all for these conversations today. And with that, I'm going to close the public hearing on Senate Bill 1187. And before we adjourn, I just really want to reflect thanks to the committee members who really openly, that we can have this time to have the dialogue that we do. We don't always share perspectives, but we do so in a respectful way, in a respectful manner, and I sincerely appreciate that. I want to thank our staff and our team, Ian, AJ, and Beth. Thank you so much for helping keep the train on the tracks.
That's amazing.
And, yeah, they deserve this. Yes, they deserve. And the ASL interpreters, thank you so much for always providing accessible and inclusive opportunity for Oregonians to really stay engaged in what we are talking about in this building. And to all the agencies as well, because as I have said this morning in Senate Education, we work through a lot of bills. We produce a lot of bills. And every agency, whether they're environmental, whether they're education, whatever they are, they have to pretend that each and every one of these bills is live and is going to cross the finish line. So they have to do all the work that they need to do in order to prepare for that. And I think we really need to have a very deep roundtable conversation about what those bill limits could look like, not only for individual members, but also for committee bills, also for omnibus bills, all those things that we need to discuss, because I truly don't feel we have an incredible professional staff, and I feels a bit disrespectful at times at how much we are expecting of them to do, working and getting emails and such at 10:45 at night. So I'm hopeful that we will have continued conversation about that. And with that, I am going to adjourn us for the day. Thank you so much.
Thank